Eoch Tanuyap, Quiget Iwans Quiansna. Hi everybody, my name is Quiget Iwans. I'm a member of the Squamish Nation and the Yagalanas clan of the Haida Nation. You're listening to Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We live, work, play, and broadcast from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
Thanks for tuning in, listeners. You can also stream us at www.coopradio.org. The show is called Buland Awaz and then followed by The Rational. Today we are going to be speaking with Bianca Wylie on how the voluntary becomes mandatory, dark patterns in the Government of Canada's ArriveCAN app. Bianca Wylie is a partner at Digital Public and a co-founder of Tech Reset Canada. After that, we're going to be talking with a guest on Iranian women protests that are happening globally and weekends in Vancouver. Followed by The Rational, we're going to have a listen to John Trudell. So stay tuned for all of this. We're going to be lining it up, coming to you momentarily. All right, and if you are hearing this, then you know that we are broadcasting from the unceded Coast Salish territories. This is Co-op Radio, and my name is Alnor Gova. The show is called Buland Awaz. It's going to be followed by The Rational. And about this time, we get involved in some issues around public affairs and so on. And at the moment, we are joined on the telephone with Bianca Wylie, a writer with a dual background in technology and public engagement. She is a partner at Digital Public and a co-founder of Tech Reset Canada. Hello, Bianca.
Hello.
Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Awesome. So, Bianca, one of the reasons we wanted to speak with you was around your recent article on the Canada app, the Arrival app. But before that, could you just give us a little bit of context around some of the work that you do at Digital Public and at Tech Reset Canada?
Yeah, certainly. So the work that I do in both places really revolves around how technology intersects with democracy and governance. And one of the ways that work sort of plays out is thinking about how do we make sure that people, whether through their democracies or through different organizing, are having more of a say in how technology works and how it impacts their lives, and particularly in the public sector, because a lot of technology, I think we understand it as commercial or new or innovation or sort of as a consumer, but there's a significant amount of technology that governments are funding, purchasing, developing. And those things are of particular interest in our work in both places. So very much on the public sector technology, how does it affect our lives and how do we try to grow our influence over it so we don't feel like we're just reacting to it or sort of seeing it as inevitable, which is often how people feel about technology.
What are some of the projects or things that you have been working on? Give listeners a context for some of the kinds of works that you're involved in.
Yeah, sure thing. So in the pandemic, I think I know we're going to talk a bit about ArriveCAN, but prior to that, there was an app in Canada that was called COVID Alert, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but basically it was an exposure notification app, and it was launched pretty early in the pandemic, and there was it was basically the government was saying, do this, use this app, and it will help you keep your family and your friends safe. And that was one of the ones that we engaged on because it wasn't working. Eventually it was broken and it was still active. And so that's an example of like dredging up research and participating in public dialogue and advocating for that app to get put away, which eventually, through the work of many people, it did get taken down, and it's gone now. So that's an example of like a public health and pandemic one.
Mm-hmm.
I live in Toronto. One of the things that I was involved in for a few years was related to a smart city project that was called Sidewalk Toronto,
Mm-hmm.
and did a lot of work over those years, trying to focus on the issues when you get a city that wants to put technology everywhere, and when you've got a corporate partner. So Sidewalk Labs was the company behind this, and their sister company of Google. That really looking at power asymmetry and what does it mean when you've got a corporate actor who wants to make choices that generally I think many of us would think are more, they're government choices, not corporate choices.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a project. Did a lot of writing, did a lot of work, and same thing. Like really just trying to have conversations and make sure that people felt that they could weigh in on these issues. So those are two examples, quite different. One was federal and health, one was cities and technology. But those are a couple examples.
Yeah, I first heard of your work around the smart cities when you and a bunch of other people were talking about it, and it was really educative for me because it was around the same time that Vancouver was also having preliminary discussions around smart cities. So I've been following your work around that. And so tell me, where does your interest in this intersection of technology and public spaces and sort of government policy come from?
So I really appreciate that question because I think it's the two things in my career that I was doing prior to working in technology policy answer it. And the first is that I worked in technology as a few things. Like I did tech support. I eventually was a product manager. So although I'm not a software developer, I'm very comfortable with what technology is, how it works, what it can and can't do, limitations. And so I'm fluent in that. And I was, working in that area for a while. And then the next spell of my career, I worked as a facilitator. So I worked primarily in cities. And that means that I would work for government agencies to design and run public consultations. So if there was going to be a new park, or if there was going to be, electrifying the trains, the kinds of community meetings where you would show up and someone would be at the front of the room, that was me. And so I used to work on process and figure out how do you take what people are saying and want to do, and how we want to live together, turn it around, provide advice to government from communities, and then see how that can influence decision making that governments take part in. So those two things really came together for me in this last chunk of my career, which is looking at how technology and democracy intersect. And for me, there's so much about this, which is building the confidence both within different, from a resident perspective or from a citizen perspective, that we do have a say in how technology is used to define how we live together, but also that there's a very different approach possible. Like states in particular sink billions of dollars into technology, and we don't direct it enough, given that it's actually public. So so I think those two parts of my background really came together when I started to work on technology and democracy and like policy. But the last piece to this is that the idea that we can take charge of this stuff without doing really fundamental literacy around it is not real. And what we've seen over the course of the last 5, 6, 7, 10, you can take it back further, governments have not taken up the effort to bring us in on these discussions. So there's definitely an element of organizing work and working with groups that don't work on technology, that work on public housing, or that work on cycling, and figuring out like how do we make these things about those issues? Because I'm not really sure technology by itself is worthy of the discussion. It has to make sense in a different context. So I think that's kind of the long work, is the organizing to figure out like how do people working in child services or working in parks and recreation, like how are they responding to some of this digital transformation is sort of the catchphrase. But software is getting layered over everything. There's no sector, there's no division in the government that isn't making really important decisions about this stuff, and they impact our rights. And so we really need to be, to my mind, more engaged with it. But I think it's going to be a long haul to shift from where we are, because right now it's very driven by commercial and economic development incentives.
Yeah, right?
So
Exactly.
how do we shift it more to public, like to actual public interest and public interest technology? What does that look like?
Right, absolutely. I mean, this is a critical stakeholder that's sort of never at the table, or if is very superficially so, right? So, yeah, it's really, really important work. And for listeners who are interested in this, can you give out the calls to where they can get more information about the organizations that you're involved with, as well as your own work? Just while we're here?
Yeah, that's really kind of you to offer up. Well, digitalpublic.io is where Digital Public has, that's our firm, and we've got some information there on sort of how we do our work, because we do data governance work specifically. Like, some people might be looking for help with technology, or like as an organization or a nonprofit, like how do you deal with this yourself? So that's a good place to look there. And then techresetcanada.org is where you can look more. And in that case, that's a volunteer organization. And if people want to join, we've got a newsletter. It's infrequent, but when we got stuff to share, we definitely share something out. And there's a few things coming. Bill C-27 in Canada is something that's that Tech Reset Canada is taking a look at now, and so we'll probably have a newsletter at the next couple of weeks. So techresetcanada.org, and there's a newsletter there. That's the best way to follow that work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. So, Bianca, clearly there's, we're hoping to invite you again so we can unpack some of these other issues that you're working on that are so critical. But we asked you today to come in and talk to us about your article that you wrote. It's titled, Canada's ArriveCAN app is Fostering Inequity at the Border. Center for Governance and Innovation. I think that's where it was published, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yes? Yeah. Help us with understanding some of the issues with the ArriveCAN app. Can you take us back maybe to the beginning of the app, and we can talk about how it's transforming itself?
Certainly, and I want to start by just sharing some appreciation for my co-author on that piece. His name is Matt Malone, and he does work on algorithmic governance, and he's a professor of law at Thompson Rivers University. So
thank you.
Just want to shout out his work is fantastic, and we wrote that together. And in terms of going back to the beginning, so I don't have the dates in front of me.
That's okay.
Just from a pandemic sort of timeline, I want to start by situating this work at the border, because the border is a really important, it's an important place politically, and it's also, it's been interesting for me to learn a bit about the history of the Canada Border Services Agency. So I want to start by sharing with listeners who may or may not know this, that that's the second largest police force in the country. And so prior to the pandemic, the Canada Border Services Agency had a very explicit mandate, and still does, that they want to modernize the border. And so what that means, and for people who have traveled and have seen over the years, like we've really been through shifts. You go from body scanners and post 9/11, metal detectors, and you got post 9/11, and body scanners were introduced, and then slowly over time you start to see different, biometrics. You see a lot of different technology happens at the border, and it's sort of tested there. So before the pandemic began, there was already a desire to modernize the border and to bring more technology to the experience of traveling, trying to enter Canada. And so when you do customs declaration, and so we may know this as, you filling in the card on the plane, the Canada Border Services Agency had an app that would allow you to fill that in an app rather than do it physically with a piece of paper and a pen on a plane. There wasn't a lot of uptake for that app, but it existed before the pandemic. So I just want to park that as a piece of history.
Okay.
So
you mean people weren't really using that app? Is that what you mean?
That's right.
Yeah, they were just preferring the card.
That's right. It didn't have high uptake, and it was a voluntary thing. It was just like, hey, it's here. You can use this if you want. I don't know how many people would find it. And then there was this shift to this app, which we now have, come to know more through the pandemic, called ArriveCAN. And it was introduced, and I don't know exactly the timeline, but we're talking early in the pandemic. And at a point, it became mandatory. And so the idea and the sort of story with it was, you have to use this app if you're going to enter Canada. And when I say app, I want to be really, really clear about this. You could either use the app on a Android or Apple mobile phone, like supported operating system.
Uh-huh.
You could also create a login and use this app on a computer.
Okay.
So if you didn't have a phone, you could log in, on a website and use the app online. And then there always has been, and it's just important, that there's always been a way that if you were really struggling with either of these, that you could call a number, get help, and get support.
Okay.
And I want to be clear that was always there.
Right.
But that in theory and that in practice can look different.
Mm-hmm.
The line to people, and the reason I knew about this app was because a family member and a friend both got in touch with me, and they said, I have to use this app. Like, I don't know what it is. I'm kind of scared. I'm already nervous about traveling. Like, what's this for?
Right.
And so that's why I looked into it, because I haven't traveled internationally during the pandemic. So I found out about it kind of late in its life, which is why I'm not super fluent on the date by date at the beginning. Mm-hmm. But the point is, this app was stated at a point in time to be mandatory, which is very, very rare. And there's an important piece of history to bring in here, which is that the privacy commissioners across the country all had said during the pandemic with COVID alert, and they weren't speaking specifically to ArriveCAN, but they basically said, you don't make technology use in a public health crisis mandatory. You make it optional. That way, if people want to use it, fine. And if they don't, you make sure you've got a very good and comfortable other approach. And so the government ignored that in this case, and they said, this app is mandatory. Everybody has to use it.
They just flipped over. They said first it was a voluntary thing, in fact, wasn't it?
At the beginning of its life, it was
right in the beginning,
voluntary.
and then the government, then despite what the privacy commissioner's recommendations, the government made it mandatory without having a good option, maybe just a phone number or something.
That's right.
Okay.
And so, and where this got tangled up, and there's a lot of nuance in here. So this is really important, is that the Quarantine Act, which is emergency order, basically. This ArriveCAN being mandatory was really the implementation of something called the Quarantine Act. And what that was, and what the Quarantine Act was about, was being able to collect information from people about their health status and understanding where they were going to go. And this was when some of the testing was going on as well. So it was a matter of saying, your vaccination information, what's your plan to quarantine should you have COVID. And the way that the app was basically, the rationale was that. It was to say, we're in a public health crisis. This is information we need to collect. We need to collect it properly. And we need to make sure that we're implementing this across the board. Like, everybody has to do the same thing. And the reason that this is really important, and we'll get to where things have just recently changed, but there is never in the history of this whole act, we never had to implement the Quarantine Act through a mobile phone or a web app. Nothing in law says that had to be done that way. And so for me, it was really confusing, because it was sort of, the app was being presented as like, we need to do this for the pandemic. It's for the Pandemic Act, for the Quarantine Act. Like, this is all public health related. But really, if you look right into the letters of the law there, it was a decision that was made to do it through an app. It would also have been possible to collect that information without an app. And that's that really critical sticking point that, for me, when I learned about this and what was going on, it was like, no, hold on a second. There should always have been multiple ways to do this. And I'm really forceful on this point because in every kind of system that we build, it's really important to have options for people, always, particularly, and this is where this really bothered me from an equity perspective. This is a public service. Like, this isn't like a consumer app. This is like the public service here. This is the thing where you don't have another choice. Like, if you know what I'm saying. So it was really striking to me that instead of doing it on an optional or a voluntary basis, and then having a parallel workflow if you didn't have a phone or you weren't comfortable with it. And so for a significant chunk of time, the app was mandatory. And then just recently, and so in earlier this year, there was a change to the app. And what happened was it went from being just about the pandemic to also being about border modernization. And so the CBSA, which is the Canadian Border Services Agency, CanApp Border Services Agency, they added into the app this voluntary option to do your custom declaration in ArriveCAN. And so what happened here was you had a whole bunch of people who had to use this app, and they were getting, in a way, trained on a different purpose for it, which is what it was always intended, which was to modernize the border. So you can see that there was this opportunity here to get a lot of people using an app that were not using it before, and to carry that sort of momentum forward so that more and more people would be using an app rather than doing, the paper and the card or a kiosk or something like that. So yeah, those like if we break it into its really key chunks from the beginning to the middle to the end of it, there was, it was voluntary at the beginning. It became mandatory, and then its purpose shifted. And then just very recently, it has been, it's not mandatory anymore as of September 30th. But yeah, that's the rough timeline of like how things went down.
And is this shifting around what you in the industry call dark patterns? Is this what you mean by this?
Yeah, so dark patterns are sort of deceptive, or like it's basically like user interface is how people talk about what when you use an app and you go to the screen and you press things, or you move around using software. You can use design to sort of make people, whether it's like click on something or accept something or participate in the software in a way that is maybe not as clear as it should be. And so the reason that dark pattern was mentioned in this article about ArriveCAN was because when the CBSA introduced this voluntary part of the app, if you are told, hey, you have to use this app, and then as you're going through it, there's this voluntary component, it's not really, I don't know, like to me, that plausible that you're going to just be like, oh, okay, well, this part's mandatory, and now this part I don't have to do, and I'm going to go over here. So it was just sort of a suggestion that it was that shift from a very strict public health rationale, and then adding in this voluntary component to be like, hey, why don't we also modernize the border?
Right? Yeah.
With the public health crisis. And this is why it was so important to know that they were trying to do this before the pandemic, and people were not into it. And so I think like using this mandatory app to sort of accelerate people's comfort or use of the technology that they weren't doing before is questionable to me from a trust and methodology from a government. Like for me, if you want to modernize the border, that's fine, but then you do it under those terms. You don't use a public health crisis to accelerate that modernization. But I mean, this is very standard fare, unfortunately, with governments that just want to get people over to systems where there's some reticence from us.
Very sneaky. That's what I think. So, okay, Bianca, is this app necessary at this point? You think the government is just wanting to converted into a border services thing, or what are your feelings as we're moving forward?
Yeah, so it was really hard for me when I realized that because the government had tied the Quarantine Act so tightly to ArriveCAN that it wouldn't be able to maintain some of the pandemic measures without the app. And I think so. So what I mean by that is that it would have made sense potentially. I don't know this because we never heard from Public Health Agency of Canada what the actual impact of the app was, right? Like, what did it, not just how many people used it or how much faster did you go through the border or did you get better information? I mean, did this do anything to contain and minimize COVID in Canada? None of us have an answer to that question, which I think that's the higher order question. With these technologies, you have to stop and go like, hold on, what are we in now? The 8th wave? Like, what is this? What did this ever do? That has not been well spoken for in terms of a public policy and the rationale. But in terms of what it is now, and the reason it was a little hard to watch this because in an ideal world, if the government would have wanted to maintain some of the pandemic measures, say whether it's about vaccination records or whether it was about masking, any of that, like it just at September 30th, a whole bunch of things just changed. And ArriveCAN was one of those. And I think what that speaks to me is that the government was unable to decouple ArriveCAN from other things that they were doing at the border. And the point is, if they wanted to keep track, say, of vaccination or and all of these open up their own debates, right? But the point is, ArriveCAN should have been able to be made voluntary without changing all these other things. And that's not what happened. And so what it is now is a border modernization tool. And there's budget in the federal government for at least another 10 months of software development. Like it's accounted for into the future. So it's not going away. And I think what we have now is much more standard fare of technology that has a very poor public oversight, governance. Like it now it's sort of like many other technologies. It's closed code. There's no advisory or public oversight. There's been no audit of how it works. So you've got the Canada Border Services Agency with more information that, sort of, is like, where's the public oversight for what is being collected on a voluntary basis? How is that being managed? And how are we paying attention to that? And it's not if you look at the history of this app, there's a whole track of questions around, like, it was a closed procurement. It was like we can't see the code. We don't know how it's working. There's no oversight from any sort of third party or, like the privacy commissioner hasn't done an audit. So there's a whole bunch of problems with this now that it's just a border modernization app. But the good news is it is voluntary. But then you always get to this larger question. Even if you fill your form in with a paper and a pencil, it's going into a system. So you can't escape the fact that, the data is in a public system. So whether it's put in through an app or put in through a card and a pencil or a pen or through a kiosk, we should be caring about how all of that is managed. The reason that the mandatory nature of this really, really bothered me was knowing that people were highly uncomfortable with it. They didn't feel, this gets us back to literacy, right? It's like they didn't know what they were doing with it. They didn't know where the information was going. It was unclear. And I think it's really, really bad when the government will just steamroll through that discomfort, knowing that some people don't feel comfortable using this technology and just pushing it through anyway. That, to me, from a public service perspective, is awful, and you should not be allowed to do that. That is much less about privacy or data collection or anything else. That's much more about what is the experience we expect when we interact with our government. I don't think people should be scared of using something because they don't understand how it works. I don't think that's a good situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, from an equity perspective, across a lot of different levels, was really, really bothersome. And I still have access to information request in as to when the government made this mandatory. Was there a discussion within the public service that there was an awareness that there's a certain percentage of the population that was going to have a hard time with it? Did they talk about it? Did they consider it? Was there a trade-off discussion? Because there always has to be one in policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, is where the real error happened. Because if you want to do these things and you make them available for the people who are comfortable, some people like ArriveCAN. Some people prefer to do this on their phone, to do this on their computer, to be uploading their passport photos in another country, like that, which to me is not great protocol,
mm-hmm.
like this, because that's part of how this works.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that is, that's something that someone should take on with confidence, that they're they're comfortable with it,
right.
that they're comfortable with it and they understand it. I really deeply dislike the idea that you just can steamroll through that and force people, which is what it is when something's mandatory, to use it. And we talked also that the consequence of this app, it had a glitch. I don't know if we want to touch on that, but there were real consequences to automating basically, pandemic-related notices to people. Like that was something that we took out of the hands of people and put into something that was being automated. And I think the reason that really matters is that if we want to be in control of these things, we need to have versions of every process where there are people that you can talk to, that can walk you through stuff and engage with you on your experience. Like that is not something we should do away with or act like that's some sort of antiquated, classic, like old school approach to being in the world together. Like, I think it's really dangerous to say, well, now we automate things because that's the future. Like, no, there are way too many potential downsides to doing it that way.
Bianca, we're going to have to leave it there because of time, unfortunately. But it's been a real pleasure sharing this with you and having you join us today. We would look forward to scheduling with you in the future because clearly this is a very, very deep issue. And it's one, frankly, that we haven't covered very often. And we should, because it's sort of like a lot of things are going on that the publics are just being unaware of. They're also participating actively in, right? And not exercising their rights, even though they may have limited ones. But nonetheless, this sort of unawareness and this idea that technology is here for the public good and for efficiency and all the rest of it is something that really needs to be critically examined. And you are one of those folks that are doing it. And that's why we would love to have you join us again.
I would love to, and thanks for making the space to talk about this. And just to wrap up on that point, like, even if the system works for you, what are you complicit in for others? Like, that's what we have to think about more with these systems. It's not just about you; it's collective. And so that's the question I'd like to leave all of us with is, how do we think beyond ourselves? And convenience and efficiency are not the ways forward for justice. Like, that for me is a non-starter. So I think I'd love to keep talking with you about it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Likewise.
It's a pleasure.
Likewise. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Have a great night.
You too.
Thanks.
Enjoy your evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So we we are still tuned in to CFRO at coopradio.org. And we were speaking with Bianca Wylie, a writer with a dual background in technology and public engagement and a partner at Digital Public and co-founder at Tech Reset Canada. Stay tuned. We are going to take a very, very short break and come back with our next guest and discuss the protests that are happening in Iran and globally. Iran